Welcome everyone to our event, Remembering Pittsburgh 2 years later. Here's CEO Dan Mariaschin.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dan Mariaschin, CEO of B'nai B'rith International. Thank you for joining us today. We want to welcome you to a special and extremely important conversation as we commemorate the second anniversary of the horrific Tree of Life synagogue shootings that took the lives of 11 people, making it the deadliest anti-Semitic attack in American history. May their memories forever be for a blessing. Tomorrow marks 2 years since that fateful day, a day that many view as a turning point for American Jewry, which had long assumed that such an attack was unthinkable in the United States. But it's also brought an outpouring of support and solidarity from Jewish communities around the country and around the world, but also from fellow Americans of all backgrounds who stand united against hate and anti-Semitism. I'm honored to have Eric Lidji with me today to talk about this crucial yet somber event. Eric is the director of the Rao Jewish History Program and Archives at the Senator John Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh, and is an author and editor who writes extensively about the Jewish history of Western Pennsylvania. Most important to today's conversation, Eric is co-editor of the Bound in the Bond of Life, a collection of reflections from Pittsburgh writers on the Tree of Life attack, and oversees a massive effort to preserve documentation of the shooting and the commemorations and other communal events that followed. Eric will speak with me about the attack's impact on Pittsburgh's Jewish community and on him personally, both the symbolic and tangible roles his city has taken in the fight against hate and his archival project, what he's gathered and what he's learned, and his reflections on why remembrance and memorialization are critical to Jewish life in America. Eric, thank you for spending some time with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's start on October 27th, 2018. I remember when I first heard the news of the attack, I was in my office, and it hit all of us in such a profound way. For each of us as Jews, this news was and remains deeply personal. So let's begin there. What did the shooting mean to you personally? Describe the moment that you found out and what your immediate reaction was, besides the horror, of course.
Well, on that day, that Saturday morning, I was teaching a Torah study class, and the parsha that week was Vayera, and we were talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and particularly Abraham's attempted intervention on behalf of those communities. And we were having a conversation about righteousness and wickedness. And I walked out, I was taking someone home, a fellow congregant, and we heard some rumors in the hall as people were coming in for services and people were leaving the class. There's that kind of cluster of people in the hallway, and somebody had heard something, and we went outside, and we didn't realize it at the time, but the synagogue locked down right as we had left. So we were out in the parking lot, and we started to hear the sirens going towards Squirrel Hill, which was just a few blocks away from where we were. And then the rest of that day was just spent in a kind of a state of uncertainty, and that strange thing that we have now in the 21st century, where very rarely you're ahead of the news cycle and you're waiting for the news cycle to catch up and tell you about something that you kind of know but don't really know. At some point in the middle of that day, the ADL put out a statement, and in their statement they mentioned that this was the deadliest incident of anti-Semitism in American history. And the nature of that hyperbole sort of clicked my brain from a community member to a professional within the community. And that's when it became clear that we would have a certain obligation and responsibility within this incident.
What triggered your impulse to begin this invaluable archival project that you started?
I would have come to it eventually. It was definitely that statement from the ADL that sort of made me realize that this was that the scale of this was sort of bigger than I had gotten my head around at the moment. I started I didn't really do anything that day, but the next day, Sunday, we had kind of the first big public event. There was a vigil held that was organized by our local federation. And that's when I started collecting things, was at that event on Sunday night.
Well, this archival project really is no small operation. In the days, weeks, and months following the shooting, there were hundreds of vigils, religious services, protests, and other gatherings. And you formed a task force, tracked down speakers, and so on. Could you give us a window into what the documentation process looked like in practice? And what are the types of mementos that you've gathered? And what were some of the objects that left lasting impressions on you?
So one of the things that's important to realize when you think about an archive, especially a community archive, there's only one archive in the country that has a law behind it that forces people to give things to that archive, and it's the National Archives. The government has to give its records to the National Archives. Every other archive in the country is working on trust. And what we were very fortunate to have in Pittsburgh is an archive that has been embedded within the community for a very long time. We were created on November 1st, 1988. So that means that 4 days after the attack, we had our 30th anniversary. And that means that a lot of the organizations in the city already had relationships with the archives and already had trust built with the archives. In the 6 months leading up to the attack, we had worked with 2 of the 3 congregations that were housed in that synagogue to archive their records. So this effort, you describe a task force, it's sort of even bigger than that. It's sort of like the whole community deciding that they wanted to do this, and the archive was just the sort of centerpiece that allowed it to happen. But as far as the mechanics of it, there's really 3 components to the archival collecting. The first are the memorial objects, and those have gotten the most attention. They came in sort of 2 varieties. One is that there was a large spontaneous memorial that appeared outside of the synagogue within, probably not on Saturday, but certainly by Sunday it had started to appear. There were these large white stars of David that were placed there, and materials started to coalesce around them. And these spontaneous memorials have become, sadly, a part of American life. They appear at all sorts of mass casualty events throughout the country. But people were also mailing things. You know, those were only the objects that people brought in person. People were also mailing things to all 3 of the congregations, to families, to every Jewish organization in Pittsburgh, received stuff from abroad. The day schools got things from other day schools. The BBYOs got things from other BBYO chapters, and so on. So that's one aspect. The second is that the community as a whole is proceeding through this path of recovery, and a lot of that happens privately, but a lot of it happens publicly. This was a public event, and so there are sermons that are delivered, there are vigils that are held, there are classes, there are programs, there are articles that are written, all sorts of things. There are protests that are held, and each of these produces documentation. And so the idea is to follow up on each of these events and figure out what documentation exists. Was there a flyer? Was there a program? Was there a recording? Did someone take photographs? And to collect all those things. And then the third is a real 21st century component to this. You know, if this had happened 100 years ago, we would stop at the paper, but it happened in the 21st century, and that means we have to reckon with the internet as well. And this was something that we had never done as an archive before. So that means using some very interesting and powerful software that can archive the internet, essentially. And so we track up all of these articles online, social media posts, websites, and collect vast amounts of the internet as well. And then as well, there's an oral history project that's going on that the archive is not leading, but will be the repository for. And so these 4 areas together, when you put all those materials together, if you catalog it correctly, you should start to get a world of materials that document the public aspects of recovering from this event.
Now, I'm curious, you mentioned the internet. Of course, the story was a global story at that moment, as all news is. What kind of effort is being made to gather what was being printed and said and what was on TV around the world?
It's really a challenge because the thing about the internet is that in the time it takes you to think about the internet, it's created more documentation than you could ever collect in your whole life. And it's really overwhelming to try and figure out how to go about doing that, especially in a way that feels comprehensive and not scattershot. And so my approach has been to draw increasingly larger circles. So the first circle for media was, we're a local archive and we're going to make sure that we get all the local media. And that meant about 24 print and online and television and radio outlets, and making sure that we got every article that they had done over the past 2 years. Once that was complete, or I guess I should say once it was up to date, the next rung is national Jewish publications. So JTA, The Forward, Tablet, the Jewish News, the Jewish Week, all these publications, and working on those. Beyond that, now you start to get into curation, because the effort to be comprehensive on a global scale for media coverage would require, full-time staff in and of themselves. And so when we get to that layer, it's, things people have sent to us, and then trying to figure out what threads do we need to follow to make sure that we've done our due diligence on a particular subject matter within the bigger story.
What I remember, perhaps remember most actually, in terms of the response, was that masthead headline in the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which carried the first line of Kaddish. Tell us about that. How did that happen? This was a very unique, perhaps the first time in the history of American journalism that such a headline was over the masthead of the newspaper.
So one of the things that I heard a lot from people over the first year was a sense of gratitude that the community seemed to have within it all the resources it needed to respond to this. We didn't really have to go outside the community too much for our basic needs. We had the archive we needed, we had the scholars we needed, we had the Chaver Kaddishas we needed. And one of the odd components is that the editor of the Post-Gazette, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette at that time, was Jewish, David Shribman. His daughter, I believe she's been ordained now, but at the time she was a rabbinical student at Hebrew Union College. So he was not just Jewish, but somebody who was in the community and kind of aware of the rhythms and patterns of Jewish life. And the line that he has said about it was, sometimes when you feel speechless, maybe you're speaking the wrong language. And when he was trying to figure out what's going to be the headline, the appropriate headline and the correct headline to introduce this to the public, he ultimately felt that the only way to do it appropriately was with the first line of Kaddish. And so it was really a remarkable thing. I think it certainly took a lot of people back, even within the Jewish community, to get the paper and see that on the front of it.
I have a colleague who actually had it framed, a colleague who is from Pittsburgh. And I used to see that framed headline every day. Was a reminder that we had really every day. The process of collecting all these artifacts is just the first step, though. Equally fascinating is the process of making sense of them all and creating a narrative, deciding how to tell their story and how to lay them out to the public, particularly as the marks of the attack on the community were and still are 2 years later fresh. So how did you approach the very sensitive process, and what were some of the issues that you found yourself confronting?
The basic principle is to let people know that it's an opportunity, not an obligation. Nobody should feel pressured into participating. They should feel like this is an opportunity to save things that they want to have saved, or to tell stories that they want to tell. But they shouldn't feel like pressured into it, or they shouldn't feel that if it's somehow painful to them, that it's something they need to re-traumatize themselves in order to participate in. So that's the basic premise. And I think once you effectively communicate that to people, it lets them know that they can participate if they want, and they can wait if they want. That doesn't mean that it's not challenging all the time. The first big challenge was the first week on the Wednesday following the attack. All this material is outside and it's threatening to rain. And we're trying to figure out, we don't own this material as the archive. It's not even necessarily clear at that moment who does own it. Does Tree of Life own it? If it's on a sidewalk, does the city own part of it? It's such a complicated thing. And And in addition to that, there's all these people standing around who are sort of actively grieving with the materials. You have across the street international news stations with 24-hour cameras trained on everything you're doing. And you're just trying to figure out how can you protect these items in a way that doesn't feel like you're sort of colonizing them or taking them over or treating them inappropriately. We were very fortunate in that the Federation was able to find all of these tents and pop-up tents and bring them, and we were able to set them up, make announcements to the people who were there saying, we're not moving anything, we're just putting these tents up to protect it and so that you can commune with these objects without getting wet. So things like that. On an emotional level, it's a profound experience to kind of engage with so many people and their pain over and over and over again. It's a very humbling experience that I certainly didn't have any previous experience in my life to tell me what that would be like. But in a lot of senses, it's an honor too. There's a lot of people who have felt the need to do something, and I feel very fortunate that the nature of my work kind of presented that opportunity to me. I didn't have to go looking for it.
Well, almost immediately, Pittsburgh became a symbol, one of unchecked white supremacy, anti-Semitism, and hate, but also one of recovery and hope. Yet many Americans seem to have moved on, as we do. The news cycles now are just cycles are every hour, every 10 minutes, breaking news. As time passes and survivors still deal with the grief after the cameras have moved away and the attention is gone, how do we make sure that this tragedy serves as a lesson on how to proactively confront hate?
One of the challenges of being a community that's involved in something like this is my own perspective on it. There's a national conversation, and that's the symbolism that you talk about. And everybody here feels that. We don't want anyone else to go through this. And at the same time, it's not a symbol. It's a experience that happened to specific people and their families and their congregation and their community. And part of the challenge on our end is trying to find a balance between the kind of responsibility that people here feel like they've been placed because their community was attacked or their congregations or their families were attacked, and the more private need to make it a specific event. So as far as how we use these materials for that larger responsibility, I guess my feeling is these objects are a rare moment when people's grief is externalized. Most of the time, everyone in our lives that we run into has some sort of grief about something, and it's mostly private. You don't ever see it. These are moments when people externalize their grief and they placed it inside of an object, and then they gave that object to somebody else as a way to forge a connection. And my feeling is that when you see the abundance of it and the accumulation of it is awe-inspiring, because all of a sudden you're visualizing something that you did not realize was there. You knew that people were in pain. You knew that people had been hurt. But when you see it, when you see the tower of these materials, I think the unspoken implication is that we have to ask ourselves whether we're willing to be a society that allows that pile to continue growing or not.
Well, I guess the follow-up question to that would be then how do we remember this tragedy so as not to let history repeat itself? And I'm hearing that this is one of the central themes that you're tackling, that this merely cannot be an event that we read about in a history book, that it must be a constant reminder of the need for a vigilant civil society that makes it clear that there's no room for such hate and anti-Semitism.
I mean, my personal belief is that the materials that emerge after something like this can only go so far, and that the other half of the story is the materials that were created before. We have 1,000 collections that document Jewish history in Western Pennsylvania. Those are the stories of life. And the materials that have come after are also materials of life. It's just life after a tragedy. And my feeling is that when people come to appreciate the lives of other people, that's when they protect them. It's just a different point of view than focusing solely or exclusively on the death. One of the challenges, you had mentioned that the news cycle kind of goes on, and one of the challenges is always to figure out a way to make something permanent or semi-permanent that allows it to survive all of us. Anybody who had feelings of affection toward the Jewish community, whether they're Jewish or not, had a profound experience that day. It's easy for us all to look at our lives and feel like, how could that feeling ever not be obvious? But someday we'll all be gone, and it won't. And the only thing that will be left is the materials that we've left behind to convey to the future how that felt. There's a moment at the end of Deuteronomy when Moses is reminding the people about the attack of Amalek, and he tells them, when you go into the land, it's going to be easy to forget that this happened. When you're wandering in the desert, it was easy to remember that this was one of many traumas that was experienced along the way. But once you get into the land and you're settling and you're getting comfortable, it's going to be easy to forget. And so you have to actively and proactively remember if it's something that's important to you to prevent it from happening again. And I think that model is something that story is placed there as a way to create an archetype for Jewish life. If you go back 100 plus years ago to Kishinev in 1903, this was an event that in a lot of ways mirrors our Pittsburgh event in a lot of ways. It was not the first instant of its kind. It was not the first pogrom, but there was something about it that felt like a new experience within Jewish life. And certainly in the months and years that followed, it kind of built on itself over and over again. And I think a lot of people in America, certainly of a certain age, kind of that word Kishinev means something to them. But can any of us name anybody who was killed at Kishinev? I can't. This is my field. And so my feeling is like the specificity is where the condemnation comes in. When we force the story to be returned to specific people, specific communities, specific events, it can no longer be a symbol. It has to be about an actual event that occurred, an actual action that took place. And when that happens, it's harder to slip out from underneath it. It becomes much more immediate in everybody's lives.
That's an interesting analogy. I've just read this fairly new, as I'm sure you have, this new history of the Kishinev pogrom. And there, the specifics are there right in the reading, the names, the places, the addresses, the streets. But you're right. When you think pogrom, you think Kishinev. And I think that in the more modern context, people will think of Tree of Life. They will think of Pittsburgh when they talk about these kinds of heinous attacks. Well, remembrance and memorialization are such an important and constant exercise for the Jewish community. As an archivist, you certainly would appreciate that. More generally, how is working on this project informed your outlook on how to put together remembrance work in an effective way that will resonate long-term with the public? Essentially, what are some of the ways that we make sure that events like Tree of Life, the attack, continue impacting our public discourse and public policies, not on into the future, not because we're from Kishinev, we're talking about 1903, but here we're talking 2 years ago. So how do we keep this memory and the remembrance and the memorialization alive, almost real time?
I think one of the big lessons that I've learned over the past 2 years, and it's something I'm still learning and I still find myself falling short of it at times, is that while it's easy to look at the product, the process is also really important. And at times, especially when the stakes are so high and the emotions are so extreme, the process is even more important. And so for us here, that process means really trying to work hard at engaging all the people who need to be engaged and making sure that everybody is kind of moving along together. It can be hard because we don't always know how to reach those people or how to find them, and it tests the limits of our own sympathy and empathy to be able to think who all needs to be included and how do you include them. But at the moments that I've been most awed by the Pittsburgh community over the past 2 years, it's when they have found ways to kind of bring the most people along on the journey. And so I think it's, this memorialization is not going to be something that we can impose on people. It's too easy to turn off whatever they're looking at. But if more and more people are brought into that process, if they're told that their experiences matter, if they're told that their experiences are part of a larger experience, if the work is done to help them document those experiences and get them in the archive, I think that the entire community together, and I use the word community in the broadest sense possible, will all be on the same page, more or less.
Well, Eric, as we approach the end of our time here today, I'd like to come full circle and ask you again about the personal aspect of your work. What impact has this immersive project had on you personally and professionally? We talked about it a little bit earlier, but I'd like to come back to it. And what do you anticipate its role to be moving forward? And how can our viewers and all those interested in learning about your work view the bittersweet fruits of your labor, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic?
Well, the fruits of the work hopefully will be available to the public next year. We recently received a grant that's allowing us to create a website where we can showcase as much of this material as is appropriate to showcase. We're in the process of creating that right now. And the goal is to have that up by a year from today. So that'll be the moment when I think the public can really engage with the materials. We'll be able to submit stuff more easily. We'll be able to connect their experience to the experiences of others. And my hope is that website really coalesces a lot of the feelings that I've been hearing from people in Pittsburgh about the power of these objects and the potential to make good use of them. So I think that's what the next year is going to be. Yeah.
Well, Eric, it's been an honor. Thank you for doing the important work that you're doing. Memory is so important to our people. And it's important to us because of our history. And it's important to us in the modern context in terms of what you're doing, which is not only to collect and assemble this material, but also to learn from it, to teach from it, and to, of course, remember. So thank you for taking the time to join us, and again, for your critical work.
Thank you so much for having me, Dan.
I want to thank Eric Lidji, director of the Rao Jewish History Program and Archives at the Senator John Heinz History Center, for joining us on this somber occasion and talking about the remarkable work that he's undertaken to document a turning point in American Jewish life. 2 years on, we also want to express our deepest sympathies and condolences to the family and friends of the 11 souls taken from us on October 27th, 2018, and to the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, which has shown incredible strength and resilience during such a difficult time. A recording of this conversation will be available on demand on our YouTube channel shortly. I also want to thank all of you for joining us, and I hope that you will come back for future discussions. Until then, take care and continue to be well. We'll see you again soon.